Hi, Joan Naviyuk. First, I want to acknowledge the sacred land that we live and work on today. It's long served as a place of meeting and exchange, and has been a site of human activity for more than 13,000 years. This land is a territory of the Massachusetts people and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people, who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. Today, this area is home to more than 6,000 indigenous people from hundreds of tribes and nations, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements don't exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation and complicity. It's also worth noting that acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. Thank you, Gail, for the introduction. Just to note that I don't live in Anchorage. Anchorage is canceled. We're never going back. I'd also like to thank the fellows, staff, and leadership of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the individuals, organizations, and families who support the work of the Institute. Thanks as well to the 5 undergraduate research partners who are working with me this fellowship year. Wanga atila Naviyuk, awiva milurunga sulikayar milurunga. My grandparents are John and Barbara Kukuluk of King Island and Mary's Igloo, Alaska. My grandfather, John Kukuluk, made his living as a renowned hunter and ivory carver. He spoke only Inupiaq. People who knew him, including the late Ron Sinungatuk, who passed away just a couple of weeks ago after a distinguished career in the humanities and arts, told me once in the Nome airport that the King Island dialect of Inupiaq that my grandfather spoke was like Shakespeare's English. My grandfather here was a master hunter of marine mammals, alvik, nixat, uruk, walrus, seal, and bearded seal, in the moving sea ice of the waters of the Emak, what we now call the Bering Sea. He obtained and made with other King Islanders the technology and materials he needed to support our family and community members through ancient, unwritten traditions passed down through countless generations of a highly sophisticated culture of ingenuity, determination, and knowledge sharing across a rich and complex ecosystem in the Arctic and subarctic. The Catholic Church arranged his marriage to my grandmother, who had been orphaned in the pandemic of 1918, the flu pandemic. And the Ursuline nuns who raised her decided at nearly the last minute to marry her off to my grandfather instead of sending her to further her education, which would have been unusual in the early 1930s for any young woman, certainly more so for an orphan in rural Alaska. So she raised 9 children, my aunts and uncles, into adulthood on Aruivak in the east end of Siknazuak, or Nome, Alaska. Aruivak, roughly translated, means a place to spend the winter. Uriu means year or winter. Vak can be translated as place. In the highly segregated gold rush town of Nome, King Islanders lived at times in dwellings like these behind my grandmother and my uncle Leonard for much of the 20th century, until the entire King Island mainland village on the eastern outskirts of Nome was destroyed in a 100-year flood in the mid-1970s. King Islanders are known as master walrus ivory carvers. My grandfather participated in the cash economy primarily by selling his ivory carvings. Here he's carving in one of the men's houses on King Island. He taught many young men to carve and to learn our subsistence practices. My grandmother, here with my aunt, Akorak Marie, spoke many languages, the Aruivak and Koyuk dialects of Inupiaq fluently, as well as English, which meant that in my mother's childhood, our family often housed anthropologists, archaeologists, biologists, and other privileged academics from America and other Eurocentric nations. My grandmother taught on King Island, too. Elders to this day recount stories of my grandmother's work as an educator. One, Nyakazuk, reminds me that my grandmother insisted that children on King Island speak and use our language in addition to English. Nyakazuk has often recounted to me a story of one lesson that remains firmly fixed in her mind. She said one day my grandmother was teaching children how to write the character in English of the uppercase cursive O. My grandma was pregnant at that time with one of her 9 children, and my grandfather would stop in at the school to check on her, bring her food. Nyakazuk said she was growing frustrated and discouraged, trying to make these uppercase cursive O's. And she told me that she said to my grandfather in Inupiaq, "It's too hard." He initially didn't respond, but kept listening. She told me that she said in English, as if to clarify, "I can't." She then told me how my grandfather took the time to encourage her to be patient and persistent. She says he told her, "There's no such thing as I can't in our language." Oyuvuk, or King Island, is roughly 90 miles from Nome, Siknasuak, in the middle of the Bering Sea. By virtue of its prime location in one of the richest habitats, not just marine mammals, whales, walrus, seals, but millions of seabirds, fish, shellfish, and countless other species. It's in the rich waters and migration routes of life between the Pacific and Arctic Oceans. The island sustained at various times 3 distinct villages of hundreds of people at once. Our inhabitation of the island extends back millennia. It's reflected in our oral histories, our ceremonial songs and dances, our traditions, and petroglyphs and pictographs on the island itself. These stories are also recorded and shared by other inhabitants of the Bering Strait and an entire Arctic region. King Islanders are well known. A number of dissertations, field studies, monographs, and other records, many of them housed here at Harvard, reflect the careers of those who study and research King Island Inupiat, Inupiat in the Arctic, and Inuit across the thousands of miles from the Bering Sea, east across the Arctic, all the way to Kalalit Nunat, or Greenland. And they reflect this culture as well. Across the Inuit cultures of the Arctic and subarctic, we have been and are connected to each other through our names, languages, technologies, and kin and trade networks. King Island measures between 1 and 2 miles in diameter. Geologically, the island dates back to the Cretaceous. Its igneous granitic Pluton cliffs rise precipitously from the Bering Sea. Its nearly vertical terrain makes it a habitat particularly well suited for millions of migratory seabirds. This gift is a gift that one of my cousins that I brought with me to King Island made, and we send it to each other sometimes when we need to be reminded of how strong our ancestors were and the vitality of the land we come from. With much of the island's coast looking like this, there are only 3 places on the island where watercrafts of any kind can make landing. The top of the island is, in some places, kind of flat. However, rock formations such as these, navatat, so-called because outcroppings there resemble trees, or navaktuk, these kind of outcroppings cover the top of the island. This is a photograph my mother took with a self-timer of herself and my Uncle Robert when they last went to the island together in 1974. But these rock formations, even on the kind of flat top of the island, prevent planes from landing, even the most advanced helicopter pilots, as well as the gale force winds that regularly buffet the island, which again is 90 miles smack dab in the middle of the Bering Sea. I think there have been a few pilots who've attempted to land seaplanes, and maybe 1 or 2 who actually have landed seaplanes on what used to be the sea ice, the pack ice around the island in the winter. In flat, calm weather like this, King Islanders master traveling to the mainland and other islands in Umiat, walrus skin boats, in about 10 hours, sometimes more, sometimes less. These migratory crossings would have to be timed carefully, as the Bering Sea, or the Imaq, is one of the world's most dangerous and treacherous bodies of water. Subject routinely to 30-foot waves, violent winds, changeable conditions exacerbated now by rising seas and increasingly intense storms brought about by climate change. For thousands of years, King Islanders made these trips in Umiat, open vessels constructed of walrus hides and driftwood, without outboard motors. We used manpower, sails, and knowledge and observation of currents and weather, including favorable tailwinds, to make massive crossings in Umiat with tons of cargo, entire villages of necessary goods brought by our people, Inupiaq, food, furs, walrus rawhide and ivory, trade goods, etc. When I first organized my initial visit to my mother's childhood home in June of 2014 with 3 other King Island women, it took us 26 hours round trip in a 42-foot crabbing vessel, the anchor point, and roughly 2-foot sea swells with light chop conditions. The most harrowing part of the sea journey was the 300 or so yards that we had to travel after making this 26-hour trip in a two-person inflatable Zodiac that we took between the Anchor Point vessel, is the name of the ship, and the area below our village that we were shocked to see has fallen into the Bering Sea. Although King Island had been inhabited continuously by a large and complex population of distinct villages for many centuries, in 1959, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs closed the school on King Island. In 1959, Alaska became the 49th of the 50 United States. Although King Islanders and the rest of Alaska's 227 federally recognized tribes have long been subject to official Indian policy, 1959 changed my mother's childhood and the very fabric of life for King Islanders in the blink of an eye. King Islanders were relocated to Nome, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, and elsewhere, anywhere there was room in federal housing projects, under the auspices of a federal Indian policy program, officially assimilation, termination, and relocation. These programs that were in place between the late 19th century into the early 1970s. The younger children of three families, mine included, remained on King Island year-round until 1965, around the time of this picture. Most King Islanders haven't been back to the island in large groups since 1959, 1965, the mid-70s, during the summer on the US Coast Guard ship called the Burton Island during the height of the Cold War. Although some King Island and other men have returned to the island to hunt, and some families, like those of two of the women who came with me to King Island, return as often as possible during the summers. In 2006, a group of King Islanders also traveled to King Island with the assistance of a multi-million-dollar National Science Foundation grant. My mother then grew up in boarding schools in Nome and in Copper Valley in the interior of Alaska, thousands of miles from King Island. I was raised in Anchorage. That's me as a little girl, which is still home to the biggest concentration of King Islanders. No matter where we live, we maintain our language, songs, dances, and our stories. I was raised closely with tight-knit extended family and language and dance. This is the last remaining drum of my grandfather, which is housed in the Anchorage Museum. He was a composer of songs. My mother and I found this drum in the museum's collections and had to hold it with protective gloves monitored by a watchful curator. The museum in Anchorage, when it expanded a couple of years ago, decided to bring this drum out of a box and collections and house it behind glass as part of an installation on the wolf dance, one of the most vital messenger feast ceremonies that continues to unite Inupiaq communities across the Arctic. That's my older son, John who a couple of years ago on a school field trip really cheerfully talked with his classmates about what it's like for a drum to stop being a drum and to exist only as an artifact. Anyhow, if you want to know more about King Island and Mary's Igloo, you don't have to look just for my books or the book of my cousin Ayahada Carrie Ojanen, who came with me to King Island. You can also look for these books, King Island Tales and People of Koarak. Without these books, I can't imagine having become a writer. There's an increasing body of work by Inupiaq writers. I can mention them later, but these are really important. I'm working on adding more nonfiction to this, assembling stories and narratives, engaging with theory, history, and a number of other dynamics. The work in King Island Tales was recorded in Nome and Inupiaq in 1983, transcribed and then translated into English, mostly by King Island women. It was published in 1988 with a King Island dialect on the left side of the book and the facing English translation on the right, line by numbered line. People of Koarak was written by William McQuillick, who was raised at Pilgrim Hot Springs Orphanage after the flu pandemic of 1918, along with my grandmother. He wrote this book over many decades, and the book was published just after his death in 1973. Although our people have thrived with foundational oral history and knowledge systems for millennia, these books instilled in me a love and respect for the written word and the unique ability of literature to connect people across time, place, and contexts. I call this lecture New Poems because I want to emphasize that King Islanders as Indigenous people have a responsibility to make new art, informed variously by our tribal histories, our contemporary lives and experiences. As I mentioned, my grandfather was a composer of songs. some for performance, some for ceremony. Others, like those my mother and others talk about, were everyday songs he would sing, taking up his drum between ivory carvings in Nome and Anchorage after we King Islanders could no longer return to the island to live permanently. This image is of Kowerak, my grandmother's homeland. I took this picture in 2002 in the Kiglue Mountains, between the Kugarak Road that leads out of Nome to the Kugarak Mining District in the interior of the Seward Peninsula, and the site of Pilgrim Hot Springs, where the orphanage still stands. In the distance, you can see the tributaries that lead to the Imirok Basin and the Bering Sea beyond. I'm an image and language-driven poet. As an MFA student in New York City between August of 2001 and 2004, I struggled to move my poems beyond the workshop setting in which the vast majority of my classmates and teachers, with the exception, in terms of teachers, of Radcliffe and Bunting Institute fellow alum Jean Valentine. Most of these teachers and classmates either wanted me to essentialize myself through the lens of Western anthropology and fix my identity as part of extinct culture. However, Jean mentored me, read my poems, and told me and my classmates that we needed to stop taking time away from the craft of my poems. It was her mentorship and encouragement that afforded me the opportunity to write what I considered my first real poem. It's called Legend. I'd experienced a kind of writer's block that many students of color can experience in dominant culture workshop environments. Frustrated, considering seriously abandoning my MFA coursework to labor in my IT day job or accept the offer of Alaskan Inupiaq Corporation venture capital subsidiaries, I sat in my graduate student housing and made despondent supplication to my ancestors, to my namesake Naviyuk, my grandparents, asking for the language I needed to make poems, to engage with lyric traditions. I sought purpose. I turned to the work in Okuluk's People of Kowerak because in that book he outlines 5 disasters that Inupiaq people have survived. I began to write explicitly about 4 of them through the lyric eye afforded by my namesake Naviyuk and the female ancestors that lost their lives or survived improbably through all 5 disasters to make it possible for me to live. The 5 disasters are as follows. A near simultaneous massive earthquake that killed many Inupiaq and animals, and then an unusual eclipse that followed almost immediately after. A catastrophic flood that erased and engulfed many of our sites of inhabitation and subsistence. A year of 2 winters, a time when summer and the usual migrations never came about, which resulted in a famine that left most communities decimated. And the flu pandemic of 1918, which, because of the way it provoked lethal cytokine storms for a majority of healthy adults who were infected, it spared the very young and very old, like my grandmother and her siblings. Here she is with her 2 sisters. And it resulted in many Inupiaq people surviving in large part by adapting to life in Catholic and other orphanages. I had to fact check this with my mom last night. This picture was taken right before my grandmother and her sisters were sent off to King Island with their marriages arranged by the Catholic Church. My great aunt in the middle was 10 years old when she was sent off to King Island. Between these 3 women, they had 24 children that they raised into adulthood. My great aunt, my oldest great aunt, ended up having 9 children who lived into adulthood, but she actually had 23 pregnancies while she lived on King Island. Okay, I'm gonna read a poem now, and then I'm gonna read a bunch of poems. This is that poem Legend that I mentioned to you. I want you to have a couple of things in mind as I read this. Poems have formal constraints of some kind. In this case, I'm writing about 4 disasters, not 5. And I only chose to write about 4 because William Okuluk mentioned, he really believed that the 5th disaster was this time of modernity after the flu pandemic, which is the 4th disaster. However, I'd like to think that along with other Inupiaq people, I can be a part of changing the trajectory of this moment of modernity that we find ourselves in. So I don't write about a 5th disaster. I kind of want to underscore that in this poem because one of the constraints that I use is the number 4. I write in 4 parts. I'm writing about 4 disasters. For the most part, I write in quatrains or 4-line stanzas. I'll get into more of the technical stuff in a second. I'll read the poem now. Legend 1. I would have been a girl bound in stone, quartz coarse, cracked, and whitening his bone. Os, echoing away from twin calderas, but for a long string which drew me to the sea. A 16-strand sinnet laying on sand marks the rivers unbraiding, knotted, and plaiting their skeins toward the basin, where a red-throated loon, shot through the eye, yields his largest rib for an awl. At our junction, a bunch of feathers. I take a brittle weed and leaf, thumb chert blade, gray. Our junction, a fumarole. When it smokes, I lose sight of the girl. It is nothing to know the rift and buckle, to witness the sun eclipsed for days on end, the bruised fields redden and freeze. 2. The sea, then, our garden, a film char of oil on water, a hiss of tides run up to that which was burning and has gone out, a slow erosion. It is one thing to give oneself to water. I bore down to a spur of myself. A bird with nowhere to land alighted on a femur, a terrible need. The land took a drink of the sea, mountain valleys soft as throats. She knew of submerged peaks recollected in an unheard song, seized in a lesser fever. The induced shore keeps still a drowned order. 3. Meant to have gone to famine in a season recurring from wind, it would not turn. Into a deep snow and sleep I shook again. If she could not beat the lightness from her clothes, it would become a layer that eddied around in mouth, myriad and everywhere. No animal stirs in the noiseless quick of a year of 2 winters but marrow, gristle of a bloated fish, roots split and cashed, skin torn from the hull of a boat long withdrawn from water. 4. Hers, a burial in damp sand by the springs. Through December, willows green there, alder bark reddens against late snow. Those dead too numerous, no loosened tombments beneath scars of rock. Nothing roots in the oldest graves, lichen lifts with a fingernail scrape. Leave belongings piled, the opaque white bead now unstrung, the unidentified fragment, ivory ferrule, the small human figure carved of wood. Okay, before I get into just reading more poems, I'm going to walk through briefly some of the craft elements of this. I guess one of the things I want to call out here is the grammar of a poem, right? So one of the things about writing in English is how very peculiar English verbs are, how irregular they can be, and how to use this, as a poet. Okay, real quick. Grammar. Thinking about verbs, they deal with action or state. They can be linking verbs, join things together that are equivalent. They're transitive verbs that take both an object, both direct and indirect, like I lose sight of the girl, or intransitive, verbs that don't take an object, like the building fell down or laying on sand. The voice can be active or passive. I do this, or this is done to me. Tense can be, as in this poem, simple past, present of perpetual truth, future tense, etc. Mood can indicate statement, question, wish, etc. In this poem, for instance, I'm interested in the subjunctive, which is often contrary to fact or hypothetical. Lyric poems can change so many tenses and moods in such a short amount of space and time as they move along, which is why it's interesting to me to work as a poet, to look at grammar. Another thing I kind of want to call your attention to in this section is the diction of English. When I hear English, I can hear the machine of empire behind almost every word. It's a language that takes things from other cultures, other lands, other languages, and rolls it, sort of steamrolls it like a huge and malicious, engine into its own language. And I'm really interested in etymology, and I'm interested in the sense that I interrogate almost every word when I write through the Oxford English Dictionary. I often wish that there were an Oxford Inupiaq dictionary, working on that. I just want to call attention to a couple of words here where the diction is heightened. Os, for instance, in the third line, which of course can mean bone. It can also mean the opening of the cervix into the vagina. Again, I'm thinking about my female ancestors. The word sinnet, which is a kind of flat braided cordage formed by pleating together several strands of rope or yarn, coarse hemp, grass, or other fibrous materials. Thinking about that, the rivers is this sort of construction. and then I guess another word I want to point out real quick is fumarole, which is a hole or vent through which vapor issues from a volcano or a smoke hole. And the etymology of that word goes back to chimney or vent. It also refers to a room or a cave in which wine was stored to mature, a smoke room, for instance. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about line length. Here I want to talk about or draw your attention to when the line's full, when it's spare. A poet decides when to draw a reader across a page and when down the page. Decides when to break a line, how to break a line. Do you break it at a part of speech like a noun, a verb, a pronoun? How do you punctuate it? What's your enjambment like? How do you create tension with your line breaks? I also want to talk about a little bit about prosody, the measure in which poems are written. Whether or not poems are written in counted lines, including a regular number of beats, or whether or not the lines are in free verse. Okay, poems are written usually in counted, poems in verse are written in units called feet, one stressed syllable or one or two unstressed, accents and breves. And English is given naturally to the iambic pentameter line, da-dun, 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 right? Which King Islanders throughout, and King Islanders first had a non-Inupiaq person on the island in 1916, so our contact is pretty recent. But the way that King Islanders imitate white speech or English speech is by saying ishkorni, 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 white man, because that's what it sounds like and sounded like to people who did not speak English at all, including my grandfather. So I'm making a departure in a lot of my work. I start with something like an iambic pentameter line sometimes, although that's not my natural speech rhythm, either when I'm writing or speaking. But I think about when to depart from that. In this section, the second section, which again is about a flood that erases the land and erases the features of the land, I think about writing in dimeter, trimeter, and tetrameter, something that's not quite a pentameter line. Thinking about the rhythm, the cadence of the poem, its rising and falling rhythms, how to orchestrate those. Thinking as well about the stanza making. Stanza, of course, being the lines in a poem that are separated by white or black or other space. And thinking as well about the terrible metaphor of the stanza as a little room, assuming that poems are houses and they have many rooms and other bougie notions like that. Just wanted to call attention to this section where I drop down away from the quatrain specifically into the couplet, smaller stanzas. Okay, third and penultimate close reading section of this poem. I want to call your attention here to the pronouns. I think one thing that you can be attentive to in a lyric poem is, looking at when pronouns change. Here, why do I move, not just in this poem, but in a lot of my poems, between the first person and the third person? A lot of times, again, because I'm thinking about my namesake Naviyuk. Other times, it's because I'm trying to create tension or get at the essential drama of a poem or move with juxtaposition. I'm also thinking of the notion that a poem is a mask that a reader can put on. It's also a sense of how to indicate how close you want your reader to be to the speaker of the poem, how far you want the speaker or the reader of a poem to be from the speaker or the thing that's going on, if there is something going on, a narrative in the poem. Okay, here in this last section, I want to call your attention to the nouns or the concrete images. Again, the backstory of this part of the poem is a flu pandemic. Of course, you have, just tracking the nouns here, you can make a lot of deductions and associative, connections, but I really want you to think about the land, the sea, the sky, connection, disconnection, living things, landmarks, things visible or invisible, and how things change. Things. Okay, so actually, I'm going to read some new poems now that I've gone through that. I could go down a big rabbit hole in terms of talking about how to make poems, but I think I'm just going to read some instead. And I'll give a 101 later at some point on all the things you missed from English 10A or 10B. But here, I'll read some poems, and I think I actually have like 7 books of poetry, so these are some of them. I'm not going to start, you can find them somehow, I don't know, go to a bookstore or a library. I'm working on some other projects now, again, mostly prose. So these are poems. Most of them are new. Some of them are old. You'd have to read the books to find out which are new and which are old, though. Okay, so here we go. Hyperboreal. Arnica nods, heavy-headed on the bruised slope. Peaks recede in all directions, in heat haze, evening in my recollection. The shield at my throat, ornamental and worse. We descended the gully, thrummed into confusion, with a last snow melt, a tricklet into mud, ulterior. One wolfbane bloom, iodine-hued, rising on its stalk into the luster of air. June really isn't June anymore, is it? A glacier's heart of milk loosed from 1,000 summer days in extravagant succession, from the back of my tongue, dexterous and sinister. Iridan. A coastline, a transitional place bears evidence of others' dwelling, a house pit in the shape of a nest, another like a knife, a noose not lost in time. Ours, a useful relationship, though not a tight one, for between us we knew there was something to lose. Fragrant in June heat, in a field of confusion, nothing like metaphor. Moss campion, minute orchids, sweet, sweet vetch. The dissolve of voices. There are 7 moons tonight, and somehow bows beyond the scaffolds. In the streets, she was lost to me. In the streets, I have imagined light, a kind of it, though it too has long since vanished. It cannot be summoned through fire or smoke or other oblivions as all the men fall away like snow, settling into new designs of havoc until sifted anew in gusts. In passing. After all, I look down and do believe evasion is not a home. In the wing bones, a susurration, a squirrel snare for our relations, a reason for the patterns of our movements, dances, a truss of staffs bound with bands stained by alder, the river's glossal, a mask subsumed in a mass of stones that seem something like a man. Bladder, blood, and lung of a bear dropped from exhaustion. A love, absolute, of places once unknown to me. Alknakutam iziva ipqanach duet ani rak miziktavik uvat kasanayet kinigawik. In a warm room, we were altered together. Beyond this, comprehended for a plural. Unachtorit, which I'll give you the courtesy of an English translation here, means people related through common possession of territory. Unachtorit. The enemy misled, that missed the island in the fog. I believe in one or the other, but both exist now to confuse me. Dark from dark, snow from snow. I believe in one craggy boundary, knife blade at the throat slight swell. From time to time, the sound of voices as through sun-singed grass, or grasses that we use to insulate the walls of our winter houses, walrus hides lashed together with rawhide cords. So warm within the willows and gathered forced into leaf. I am named for your sister Naviyuk, call me Asang. Surely there are ghosts here, my children sprung from these deeper furrows. The sky of my mind against which self-betrayal in its sudden burn fails to describe the world. We, who denied the landscape and saw the light of it. Leaning against a stone wall ragged, I began to accept my past, and as I accepted it, I felt, and I didn't understand, I am bound to everyone. Seish. The Rift Lake, too, refuses coherence of any sort. Its ice encircled by trees, dark though slowless, whose unleafed limbs yaw untroubled by snow, in its own right dense and historical. And so, let us forget metronymic rhythm, improbable as it is beautiful. A cold moon, a talk scene, peeling. The page become an outline for the lake entire, which, as we see, is not whole. On an overflowed shore, the fractures give unto other fractures, minor but not of little matter. In months to come, the children will draw distinctions between shock and aftershock, note the beads of sap globed gold from the fissured truss that would be what? Body of woman swindled down to water. I split ourselves into the brimming sky. Rehearsal for surveying the ruins. Unable to construct a more compassionate narrative, I have drowned and turned back into myself, pitiless, traveling north against the waves. If, at the end, I remain paper thin, I do not want to hear ceaselessly of it. I no longer circle the graves of the dead, the ones who exact so much from the living. Beneath the birch whose limbs had grown too large, I left 11 laniaries and poppies gone to seed. Some objects I slipped from their brackets. Others we concealed from all seers, save the skulk of polar foxes in their blue morph, who may soon inhabit what yet stands of the house as we abandon it. Let us thwart deceptive emptiness and suppose a deaccessioned hawk and handsaw through the scuttle, for I had, and would have had again. Rookeries. All men knew a secret of the northern part of an old world, a less perfect idea. For the bicornuate woman, it is an island. If there the birds lose our trust, we might learn their language. After all, we have been taught to read and write, to remove our hands from other work as we watch water twist into rock, to cover our wounds, staying alive, light after light. For something, I worry. The moon pronounces with clarity its known topography. Our letters and lists, reconstructed grammars, they replace the ways in which we were grabbed, then pushed and shoved. A fine wife and her children set to rove with indefinite orders, lineal migration on a small scale. A purpose was not nautical, but conflictual. Of those men, we knew I could never do them any good. In this way, I forget, and let the wind and river such gales and tears at my shoulders and wrists. This is the penultimate poem I will read. It is called Dark Traffic, and it is the title of this next book I'm working on, or have finished. And its epigraph comes from James Merrill, which is, yes, melting changes the whole picture. And it's kind of a nod, just like some people are called an Eskimo's Eskimo, some people are called a poet's poet. So anyway, James Merrill. Dark Traffic. In the snows buffer the sound of a voice set forth. I thought you lost already, that you had gone to neglect the late migration. Before it ceases, the ice collapses easily. There is no day without a symptom. Consolation may turn out to be a guttural practice after all, the small gesture of sound lodged deep before it glides without warning downward. There is nothing but the wind, a howl and dive where water is thrown over water and sown into it. A howl and dive of wind, water over water, where once we found ice, where the snow once stuttered the sound of that shouter shouting for this listener, holding her head in her hands, the head in its fine, blank way, an original. Okay, last poem. Once again, Ilighanamik. This poem is called Nunetak. In a strait, some things are useful. Others, true, she turns to ash. Thrust thus, her head thick with arrogance, infection, and futility. It could be how a young wife went, strewn with net-veined willow and mountain avon, trespass and wreckage. She could write about the year she turned to heat and haze, to lays, imumurat, imarak dunga, of cannula and silver nitrate, of petiolus and akeen about to begin again, of greens as they green, of a man aged, eskered, of a confined gleam, to hereby dissolve and hold for naught the soil, gravel, silt, groaning as the tools of our penultimate glacier, a glacier I might pronounce like grief. One does wish for words to thaw in the mouth, but find instead a tongue welt, erosional or depositional, raised and visible, rift into language and grit. Thank you.